Thanks everyone for coming out to this talk about nuclear power, my new JavaScript library. Okay, that's not true at all. My name's Richard Campbell, and I'm delighted to be back here in Porto again. This talk is unusual for being here, and I'll give you a little history of how it happened. So I make podcasts. Any .NET Rocks listeners in the room? Oh wow, okay, that's awesome. Thank you so much. My friend Carl Franklin started .NET Rocks back in 2002, before the word podcast existed. So that's why we call it an internet audio talk show, because we're not clever enough to come up with the word podcast. And I make a couple other shows as well. So .NET Rocks is aimed at the .NET developer. We talk about anything we think a .NET developer cares about. And been putting out shows every week, sometimes as many as 3 a week. And we're at 1919, so end of World War I. Not bad. I also do a show called Runners Radio, which is for sysadmins, for IT pros, which I've been doing since 2007 every Wednesday. So we're at 900 something of that. And then for a brief interval, we made a show called The Tablet Show for about 3 years. All about the same rough format where we have a guest that's an expert in some space and we talk about to them for a little while. But on .NET Rocks, for many years now, I've been making shows called Geek Outs. So this is sort of a filtered list of a few of the Geek Outs. There's about 100 of them. And for a period there, I was doing one every month. And it was whatever geeky subject all of you wanted, which just gave me excuse to do more research and to pull data together and to try to put a good hour on various subjects. And weird things happened along the way. You know, I did a talk about building bases on the moon, and then NASA called, which is cool. I did one on geothermal power, and I got invited by this geothermal power conference to come and speak there. And it's like, you know, I'm just a podcaster, right? And so this particular one, talking about nuclear power, really came out of the worldwide energy production geek out. So I didn't intend to make these as talks. They were podcasts, and then various folks asked if I would do them as a talk, and then the regular conferences said, hey, would you come back on these? And so I've been doing this sort of future of energy talk for a few years now, which I tend to tune to the place that I'm in. Like, part of what makes it fun for me is not only talk about what we could do with energy going forward, but how a given country's currently doing it. Last year I did Future of Energy here in Portugal, and really enjoyed understanding the Portuguese power grid and how they're going about things and how it's evolving into less carbon emissions, more efficiency. And I keep getting this question, you know, we only talk about nuclear power very briefly in there, and folks wanted to know more about that. Now, this is not particularly important to Portugal. I don't know how many folks are from Portugal that are here. Just a few? Not too many. Okay, because you have no nuclear power. The one research reactor you have, you've now shut down as well. There was a proposal in the early 1970s to build a very large reactor in Portugal. And then there was, let's say, political changes in Portugal. And it never got built, and not likely that it ever will get built. So it doesn't make a lot of sense in this context. But I do want to go through some thinking about how nuclear power has stalled worldwide, and some future possibilities that support the needs of civilization going forward. But we have to do some fundamentals. So let's start with the atomic model, because you can't really talk about splitting atoms if you don't have a good picture of what an atom is in the first place. Now, admittedly, these are all lies we tell to children, but they're good lies, they're useful lies. And it wasn't that long ago that we didn't understand this, barely over 100 years ago, that we started to get this idea that every atom is made up of a nucleus containing at least one proton, if it's hydrogen, and perhaps some neutrons, and then a shell of electrons around it. And the number of protons in that nucleus identifies what kind of element it's going to be. And when we talk about fission, we talk about breaking an atom apart. Now, this leads to the periodic table, and if you have only one proton, then you're hydrogen, and if you have 2 protons, then you're helium, 3 in your lithium, then beryllium, and so forth down the line. You've probably seen one of these back in school. The actual history of developing this is extraordinary too, because it's not like you can look at atoms. They're really, really small. It's hard to take pictures of them. But we're particularly interested in, when we talk about power, in the actinides, because that's where the action is in terms of actually being able to make atoms that are radioactive, that naturally emit neutrons and potentially protons over time. So let's start digging into this. The real action around fission, human-intended fission, is only 1939. So really not that long ago, especially when you think about that the bomb was built by 1945. But it was Lise Meitner and Otto Fisch, and believe it or not, for a long time they only ever talked about Otto Fisch. Like, every time you see a really great scientist pushing against technology and doing these breakthroughs, there was almost always a woman involved. It's just that for decades it was never talked about. Always talk about it. So believe me, like, Lise Meitner was not Otto's assistant. They were peers. Arguably, she was better at it than he was. But these are the two that first deliberately fissioned uranium, ever. And they wrote a paper about it. They were working under Niels Bohr, the guy who had pretty much drawn out the atomic model in the very beginning. You were using radium to bombard they were using radium to bombard a uranium atom and had it actually fission into other products. This is transmutation when it happens. It's kind of crazy. And by the way, all the math they did around it to show the energy yield and so forth matched up exactly with Einstein's paper from 1905. So that guy, 35 years before, had pretty figured out that energy and mass had a relationship, and if you were to split an atom, this is how the math would work out, and this is how much energy you released, and he was correct. Not bad. So what they were actually doing is they were using uranium-235. So uranium has 92 protons in its nucleus. That's what makes it uranium. The 235 is actually the difference between that 92 and the 235 is the number of neutrons. And the combination of protons and neutrons makes the actual weight of the atom. Uranium has a number of different isotopes, and 235 is a fairly rare one. Naturally occurring uranium, the stuff we find in the ground, is mostly uranium-238, and it has less than 1% 235 in it. But 235 has these very unusual characteristics, that when you hit it with a neutron, it would briefly absorb that neutron, become uranium-236. And then it would fission, it would split into something else. In this particular case, it's splitting into barium and krypton, and release several neutrons, 2 to 3, at the end of the reaction. This is what they call a fissile element, that by being hit with a neutron, it splits into other elements. It's also transmutation. Like, it's weird to think about, because alchemy is pretty much frowned upon. You can't make lead into gold, but you literally turned one element into another element by splitting it, right? And there's specific ratios that go on here. It's all conservation of protons, and you get these additional neutrons off. But this discovery leads to the research papers that say, hey, this is a source of energy, and it could be very useful or it could be very dangerous. It's almost certainly both. Right? If you control this reaction, you can generate a lot of power from it. If you don't control it, you're going to make a heck of an explosion. Again, it's 1939. The situation around the world is a little hairy, right? We've really only just begun the path down on atomic physics when this is sort of revealed. They also show that if you do this reaction in water, water slows the neutrons down. A naturally emitted neutron from something like a neutron source like radium is moving a significant fraction of the speed of light. And those, what they call fast neutrons, they don't collide with the nucleus of atoms very often, but when they do it at a very high energy rate. But if you send that neutron through water, it slows it down, and it's far more likely to collide it. Instead of calling it a fast neutron, you'd think they'd call it a slow neutron, but physicists aren't that simple. That's a thermal neutron. And so the thermal neutron increases the likelihood of collision, gives you a different fissioning reaction, is a bit more controllable. So we call that fluid a moderator. So in this case, water was used as a moderator, but there are other moderators. And as we start to explore how to use this capability to generate energy, the type of fuel we use, the type of moderator we use, and the working fluid we use, the way that we take that energy and move it, vary from design to design. But let's jump back into the history. 39, we've deliberately split the atom for the first time. We're thinking about the possibilities. We need more uranium-235, right? 235 is sort of the secret sauce here. And in England, where a lot of this research was going on, a group called the MOD Committee says, if we enrich uranium-235, we get a lot of U-235 together, it'll make for a power source and or a bomb. The Americans grab all that information up, and they begin the Manhattan Project. So over in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, one of the things the MOD report talked about was how to increase the concentration of uranium-235, and was using a device called a centrifuge. So they would make uranium hexafluoride. So they would combine fluorine with uranium, which is naturally a gas at reasonable temperatures, and you would pump that gas into this cylinder that was spinning at a very high speed. And the minute weight difference between uranium-238, which has more neutrons in it, and 235, which has fewer, means that the 238 would tend to collect towards the bottom of the container, and the 235 would collect towards the top. And they would vacuum the top off, and that would have a higher concentration of 235, and they would rinse and repeat over and over again to increase the concentrations of U-235. In Tennessee, they made 50,000 of these, running 24 hours a day, and were able to produce about a kilogram of pure uranium-235 per day. And you will see occasionally on the news certain rogue states that are doing gas centrifuging to create enriched uranium. This is what we're talking about. Okay, so this goes back to early days of World War II, and they're trying to make enough U-235. Now, when they make enough of it, they do make a bomb from it. So the little boy bomb, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, contains 63 kilograms of 100% uranium-235. It was dropped by the Enola Gay over Hiroshima. It exploded about 200 yards or 200 meters in the air, destroyed most of the city. It was also an intensely dangerous bomb to handle. They weren't allowed to drop it into the ocean if they lost control of it, because it was very likely to go off. They only ever made one enriched uranium bomb. They would never do it again. It's just not a good way to make a bomb. We need enriched uranium for other things, but we don't use it for weapons most of the time. At the same time that this process is being matured and they're starting to make enriched uranium, Enrico Fermi is working in Chicago to build the very first nuclear reactor, romantically named the Pile. It was a collection, it was many, many tons of both uranium oxides and pure metallic uranium. They were trying to figure out how a reaction naturally cascades. Now, this was not particularly dangerous. The energy levels were very low, but it was very experimental. They were literally shifting different blocks in and out of the stack, the pile, to see if they could figure out the rate of reaction. And what they discovered is that a certain amount of uranium, close enough together, the neutrons keep hitting each other and kicking off more neutrons. And they call this concept the K rate. So if you have a K rate below 1, the neutrons naturally stop. The reaction level drops down to ambient. If you get a K rate slightly above 1, the neutron rate increases and increases and increases and generates more and more heat in the process. And if you lose control of the K rate, you have a critical event or an explosion. So they did this underneath a sports field at a university in Chicago. They did not lose control of it, so you've never really heard about it. And in fact, ultimately, they buried it there. And then later dug it back up and dismantled it and moved things around. But these experiments then sort of set the stage for how we make a reactor. And interesting to point that we had a reactor before we had a bomb. But they also learned through this process that you could do something with uranium-238 that you couldn't do with 235, which is that you could transmute it into other elements. And the normal chain for 238 was to become plutonium. So when struck with a neutron, uranium-238 becomes uranium-239, right? You just added a neutron. And then something weird happens about 23 minutes later, some of the time. You have what's called a beta decay event. A beta decay event is when one of those neutrons, which is not happy being in that atom, becomes a proton. Now, at the time, they believed that what happened was the neutron split apart, that a neutron was actually a proton and an electron stuck together, which kind of makes sense. It would have a neutral charge. And in fact, when a beta decay event occurs, an electron is emitted. The thing we understand today with quarks makes it even weirder. that one of the top quarks flips to a bottom quark, which becomes a proton, and an electron is spontaneously generated because the universe is weirder than we can think. Anyway, the bottom line is the beta decay event occurs, which means there's a new proton in the nucleus, which means it's a different element. It's now neptunium. And when struck, and if you give it a little time to decay again, and another beta particle emission occurs, another electron spins off, it's now plutonium. Notice the names: uranium, neptunium, plutonium. Physicists are not that clever. But plutonium had never been seen naturally. Now, it did exist, it was very rare. But at the time, they'd never seen it before. And it had the same potential as uranium-235, and it was fissionable, that when hit with a neutron, it would break apart and release a bunch more neutrons. And in fact, it was expected to be more powerful, and in fact, it was. So the Americans then built a reactor for breeding plutonium in the Hanford site in Washington State. And they would feed 4 metric tons of uranium-238 into this process, and over a period of 4 days, those tons of uranium would become a kilogram of plutonium. They made about 250 grams of it a day. But it only took 6 kilograms to make the implosion device that became the bomb known as Fat Man, the one that detonated over Nagasaki with 21 kilotons of explosive force. It's also what was in the Trinity device, or what they called the gadget. So this was the first nuclear detonation, using the implosion techniques to compress 6 kilos of plutonium. And in fact, all nuclear weapons from then on were plutonium-based. Today's modern weapons still have a core based on more or less on what the Trinity device is. There's a little more sophistication to it, but it uses essentially the same technique, because it's much stabler and lighter and smaller. Now, we don't really need to go deeply into nuclear weapons, and if you would like to, I have done a geek out on it. It's the most depressing geek out for me to have made. And it's also very popular with people to put children to sleep. Because apparently I do almost all the talking, because even Carl is shocked at what I'm saying. And I'm fairly depressed, having spent a couple of weeks researching all that, so I'm a little less lifted in my tone, so apparently it's very calming, except for that part where I'm actually talking about destroying the world. Anyway, at the end of the war, the Americans have done well. Their nuclear devices have worked so far, and there's a fellow by the name of Hyman Rickover, he's an admiral, who's in charge of the submarine forces. And in 1947, he gets money from Congress to build some of the first nuclear reactors ever, specifically to create submarines that don't need to surface. He will, of course, succeed with a vehicle called the Nautilus. This is actually the test article that they built in Idaho, which, if you don't know the geography of America, is nowhere near an ocean. It's well inland, on the wrong side of a mountain range, actually, but it was close to the Hanford site, which is where they were producing a lot of the materials, so it was a good place to do the experimentation. They validated the reactor would work. It would lead to the vehicle known as Nautilus, and that entire arms race. We're now racing into the Cold War. But he got his first budget in 1947, and by 1953, he had a working reactor called the S-1W. And arguably, that's the very first reactor, and of course, it's a military application. And as we talk more broadly about commercial nuclear power, you're going to see it over and over again. Most of the research that makes this technology work came from the military, and the military's needs, and the military's extraordinary budgets, largely based on irrational fears. The Soviets had developed their own nuclear weapon by spying successfully on the Americans by 1949. So the instability there is sort of balanced. Now we're well into the race of the Cold War, and this is about the time that Eisenhower does his famous speech in 1953 called Atoms for Peace. So now that the Soviets have the bomb and the Americans have the bomb, the Americans at this point have conducted about 40 test explosions since the war, so in less than 10 years, as they're still experimenting. They're also on their way to developing the thermonuclear weapon. So now we're going to move from kilotons to megatons, city killers. Part of the reason we need to make the bomb bigger at this time is that our aiming systems are not too good. The best missile accuracy we've got is maybe 5 to 10 miles range, so the answer is to make an explosion 5 to 10 miles wide. That way you'll hit your target for sure. And one would argue those weapons are now obsolete because our accuracy with our contemporary weapons are now to the point where you get to pick what window you put it through, so don't need as big of a bang. But that was not the time. This is 1953, and Eisenhower's pitch is we don't have to fear this technology. This is the place, this is where he uses the line, power too cheap to meter. And he makes good on the promise that he actually commits a lot of funding into maturing commercial nuclear power. Why? Let's talk about that. So by 1960, Westinghouse has the first commercial reactor up and running in Rowe, Massachusetts. It's relatively small, about 180 megawatts. It's a decent-sized power plant for the time. And this reactor you've never heard anything about because it ran from 1961 to 1991 without incident. And then it was decommissioned, site was cleaned up, and completely dismantled by 2007. But its template is the same for the majority of reactors in the world. About 70% of all reactors fall into this category known as the pressurized water reactor. So on the left, we have the reactor core. Let's see if this is going to work for me today. So there is our pressurized assembly, and it has a water loop. So we're using water both as the moderator to slow the neutrons down and as the working fluid. The water heats up as the reaction goes on, and it is pumped through a primary loop. It's isolated. That water is extremely pure, but it'll occasionally pick up dust from the reactor core that's radioactive, so you want to keep that inside the containment vessel. But you have a heat exchanger with a separate set of water that collects that heat from the primary loop and takes that heat out to steam turbines. The steam turbines make the electricity, then cool and condense the water back down, and it goes back to the secondary loop again. So these rocks get hot. You take that heat, turn it into steam, spin turbines, this makes electricity. You want to make more electricity, you put more loops on, and you run the reactors hotter, faster, because you've got more water through them. So we were able to make reactors over a gigawatt this way by having 3 or 4 loops running off of a given core assembly. Remember those rocks, they're made into pellets. So little cylinders, hold them in your hand. And they're perfectly safe to do so, by the way, clad in zirconium, stacked in columns, then racked together in these cages, 16 by 16. The spacing matters between them. And then each of those racks is assembled into a core assembly. There'll be as many as 60 of them spaced around. The reactor core assembly then has a central portion that is the actual, where the reactor is. This whole chamber is filled with water. The arrows you're seeing is the direction of the flow of the water. So water comes into the bottom, comes up as it heats up, and then flows back out again. At the bottom, there's a set of sensors to measure the temperatures and conditions in the reactor vessel. At the top, there are control rods. These rods are made typically of boron or other neutron absorbers that you can slide down between the core assemblies to slow down the radioreaction. Your goal is like a K of 1.1 to warm the reactor up. And then as you get it to the temperature where it's producing the power you want, you put those rods down a little bit more and you settle that K right at about 1. Hold it steady to just keep the temperature steady. And those first generation pressurized water reactors, they were pretty much entirely operated by hand, right? There were skilled people operating them, many of them ex-military. They'd been in the submarine systems. They'd had a few years of operating submarines, and so they became the training grounds to operate these original reactors. The second generation reactors, which are still the majority of reactors today, what we call Gen 2 plus, have a bit more automation around. They still need to be actively cooled and pumped, but they have a lot of more safety systems installed. And we're only just beginning in the few places that new reactors are still being built to create what we call Gen 3 reactors. Gen 3 reactors are passively cooled. They don't even need pumps. If you leave them alone, they'll shut themselves down. But those are relatively rare because we've not been building much in the way of new reactors. Now, as those reactions go on in the core, the uranium starts being turned into other things and it gets damaged. And so eventually you need to refuel. And the refueling process is the tricky bit. You notice at the top of this assembly, there are studs. The top of this whole reactor comes off so that you can get the cores out. You have to do all of that underwater or it will catch fire. Right? There's enough uranium in there, close enough together, that without the moderator of water to slow the neutrons down, the neutrons go fast, the cores will begin to burn. And that's a very, very nasty smoke. Do not breathe this. So when they're going to refuel a reactor, and that's typically every 2 years, they'll do a refueling. So the reactor shuts down, takes a few weeks to cool off, then they take underwater, they'll lift the lid off the reactor assembly, and they'll pull out some cores. Now, the cores aren't all the same age. They typically a given core assembly will stay in a reactor for 6 years, 3 sessions, and they'll move around between the sessions. So when it's a new core, it goes towards the center where the neutron concentration is the highest. And then after 2 years, they're going to lift it and move it further to the edge. They're going to take the oldest third out and put them into a separate assembly for reprocessing. They take the mid-aged and move them around, and then they take the new stuff and put it in the middle. And they have to do all of that underwater. So typically, as they're pulling those individual assemblies out, those square blocks, they're doing it underwater, and they lay it on its side, and it goes through a transfer tube over to the storage buildings. This primary containment vessel is so strong, you can shoot artillery shells and not damage it. Just ask the Russians. They've tried. Or crash an airplane into it. Like, it's very tough in there, right? It's designed to contain some pretty nasty things, mostly steam explosions. And so on the other side, we're not dealing with as much pressures and so forth, so we have the core assemblies, but everything's kept underwater. They're not shining lights on those core assemblies. That is Chornobyl radiation. There's enough energy still in those cores, even though they're not being run, they glow blue. The kind of blue that makes you think, that's not good. But they will gradually cool down, and when they get to a certain temperature, they can be disassembled and reprocessed. So this is a fuel handling area, and it's all held underwater. You can swim on this on the surface, and it won't hurt you. Just don't dive down. Also, you will go to prison for swimming in this. Don't do that. Now, at the end of a run of 6 years with a given core assembly, it's far from used up. A certain amount of it, so we started out with an enriched uranium core, right? Instead of the normal 0.7% of uranium-235, we enriched it up to 4% for a pressurized water reactor. The bulk of it is still uranium-238. We then run it for 6 years, and at the end of 6 years, we have this at the bottom. Mostly still uranium-238. So it's primarily still uranium. But we've also made a bunch of plutonium, and this is one of the reasons that the American military matured the light water reactor, because it made plutonium along the way of making energy. So when they reprocess the fuel, you'd run a typical 50 metric ton fuel assembly. Any given 1/3 set, about 16 metric tons would come out, and at the end of that, you'd have about 150 kilos of pure plutonium, enough to make 40 bombs. It's a good deal. Right? You got the industry to pay for it, you made electricity for homes, and you made bombs. The stuff in the corner there, the fission products, is the tricky part. Remember when we initially showed you that fission reaction and we made barium and krypton, right? You're conserving the number of protons in the process and kicking out some neutrons, but it decays out. It depends on the reaction, and there's a lot of them. You get charts like this, fission fragmenting. So there's the two weights. They're going to always balance each other out. This particular weight, so this is a U-235 fission, so it's going to split the U-235, and in this particular case, the initial split made xenon-140 and strontium-94. Now, these are both very radioactive versions of those elements, and they're not happy. The atom has too many neutrons in it, and so it's going to keep kicking off beta decays over and over again. The first one's 14 seconds after the initial reaction, then 64 seconds. You notice they're getting slower as the atom is trying to stabilize, and it's just creating new protons out of neutrons. So that slowly you go through from xenon to cesium to barium to lanthanum to cerium, which is actually the stable point in that particular chain. Every split player is different, every decay sequence is different, and some of these products have really nasty effects in a reactor. Xenon's a notorious one because xenon is a neutron absorber. it can handle a tremendous array of neutrons. And so it tends to be when neutrons hit xenon, they stick. And they stick for often quite a while. And if you've watched any of the Chornobyl movies, they talked about the xenon poisoning that was happening in the reactor. That it built up enough xenon, it was absorbing enough neutrons that as soon as there was a crack in the xenon escape, the reactor ran away. Because suddenly all that neutron absorption stopped. But there's another thing to think about here. You're transmuting elements inside of those solid rods, including gases. Those rods begin to crack. And if they were to crumble, that would be bad. Right? If they fall into the bottom of the containment vessel and you're no longer controlling them properly, you can have a runaway reaction. And so we take them out long before the potential value of them in energy is used up, because it's simply unsafe. So we use relatively little of the fuel's potential. But in the old days at least, we used to reprocess the fuel. This is a processing flow chart. We thought software was hard. Chemical reprocessing of the fuel is an incredibly complicated process. And a place like France, where the majority of the electricity is made by nuclear power, this is what they do. They take these fuel assemblies apart once they've cooled down, they run them through a series of chemical processes, they get the uranium back from them, and they pull off those fission products and handle them separately. And they make it back into new fuel. In fact, in the early days of nuclear power, everybody did this because uranium was relatively hard to find. But the Americans stopped. And it's because of politics. So back in the 1976 election, Gerald Ford, which was the unelected president of the United States, because the previous government had a vice president named Spiro Agnew who got indicted and had to resign, so there was no VP, and the president was Richard Nixon. He suddenly resigned. And he had appointed Gerald Ford as his VP when Agnew was gone, and so suddenly Ford became the president, but he had never been elected, and now he was running for his very first election. And I really got nothing bad to say about Gerald Ford, but he wasn't much of a campaigner, and he was running against the peanut farmer. And again, that dude just turned 100 years old, and he builds houses for people who need them. It's hard to be unhappy with Jimmy Carter. And we know that Carter won, but one of the things that Carter campaigned on was the end of nuclear proliferation. And he said, hey, we reprocess this fuel to get the plutonium out to make more bombs. If I become president, I promise to stop reprocessing the fuel. To which Gerald Ford said, that sounds like a good idea. Let's stop now. He just tried to take that campaign item off the table. But he also ordered, through executive order, that all nuclear power plants in the United States stop reprocessing fuel. And they never have again. That was 1976. The question you have to ask is, what's happening with all that fuel? It's sitting in tanks in the water beside the reactors since 1976. Remember, they only run them for 6 years, so it's only so many cores. They're running out of storage space. It's a problem. But the other thing that had happened was we'd found a lot more uranium. The Canadians had it, the Australians had it, and so making new core assemblies was not that expensive, and reprocessing was really hard and expensive, and pretty toxic. Today, if we were going to restart fuel reprocessing, we'd have to come up with a better cycle. And the French have, by the way. What the French did is, instead of shutting down fuel reprocessing, they just incorporated the plutonium into the rods. They called them mixed oxide fuel rods. So they burned them in their reactors instead of making bombs out of them. So there are solutions to that problem, but that's not what's happened in America. They just stop reprocessing fuel. Okay. Since we're in the Carter era, let's talk about 3 Mile Island. Because you can't talk about nuclear power without talking about the famous incidents. And by the way, there are more incidents than these, but we're going to talk about 3 that most people know. 3 Mile Island, Chornobyl, and Fukushima. So 3 Mile Island is 1979. This is an early generation 2 reactor. It had 2 pressurized water reactors in it, both about a gigawatt, 800, 900 megawatts each. It's one of the things to understand about nuclear power, even up till today. Each reactor is pretty much bespoke. These reactors were built at the same time, but they actually have different power ratings because their cores are slightly different. You build them custom to the site, and it's part of what makes it so crazy expensive. They took far longer to build than expected, and at the time, reactor 1 was shut down for refueling. So reactor 2 was running at full bore, at 97% capacity to provide electricity. there have been some maintenance incidences that had caused some problem with feed water pumps and some control issues. So reactor design is pretty much the same, a little bit more detail. This is a Gen 2 reactor, so it has a few more controls in it. So there's our primary reactor assembly. This is the heat exchanger, right? This is where they make the steam to turn the turbines. And there's some pressure valves and bleed-off valves and things up here, all of which become very important. And it's only a Gen 2 reactor. It's 1979, which hair's too long, everybody smokes, they have really big mustaches. So the first issue that happens is that there is some maintenance that had been done earlier had tripped off a bunch of feed water pumps that were not adding new water to the loop. And so the water level drops down a little bit on the steam generator, and that trips a safety system that just says, okay, don't run the turbines if we don't have new steam coming in because you'll burn them. So the moment that the steam generator stops running, you're not taking heat out of the reactor anymore. So the temperature starts to climb in the reactor. It's, again, not that weird an event. There's no real panic here. But in few seconds, that steam temperature is high enough that you get a steam bubble in the reactor vessel, and that's bad, because if that bubble starts to push down and exposes the core, we'll get some fast neutrons, everybody's gonna get a sad day. And so there's a pressure relief valve to bleed off that steam. It's that valve at the top called the safety valve, right? So the PRRV pops open, and it starts bleeding off the pressure. As the pressure climbs a little bit more, it's not bleeding it off fast enough, they scram the reactor. That is to say, the reactor rods now drop fully to stop the reactor from stop its reaction as quickly as possible. But this reactor is big enough, and this is true of most reactors, that it's not going to cool down that fast. The neutrons may stop, but there's a lot of residual heat. So while the reactors stop, it's not going to cool down. So that scram event is 8 seconds after the turbine trip. Okay, so no humans are involved here. This is an automated safety system. The turbine trip because there wasn't enough steam coming in, the temperature pops up, valve pops open, scram comes down. Okay, so now there's a lot of red lights on. Everybody's like, okay, what's going on? We are now in decay heat. So where the reactor had been running at 97% just a few seconds before, it's now running at 6%. But the decay heat is still a lot, okay? So now, the feed water pumps start running in to pump more water through the reactor as fast as possible. But that's what tripped the event in the first place, because they were shut off. So the feed water event, they say they're turned on, they didn't actually turn on. So folks are concerned they're concerned the temperature's not falling fast enough. They're not sure, they don't know that the water's not coming in, they're not reading the right signals on it. So they think, okay, maybe we're losing too much water out of the relief valve. So they hit the button to close the relief valve. And the light turns off, indicating that the valve is now closed, except the valve is not closed. Because in the original design of the reactor, they didn't have a light to indicate whether the valve was open or closed or not, and so they ordered to add that capability. And what they did was they wired the light to the solenoid that signals the valve. So you latch the solenoid, so the light turns off, but the frickin' valve didn't close. And there was no sensor on the actual valve. People make mistakes. So let's continue down the delighted line. So normally, if they were losing coolant, which is why they thought they should close the valve, pressure and water level should decrease. But it's not what's happening, right? The pressure's going down, but the water level seems high because there's so much steam still escaping out of a valve they think is closed that it reads like we still got pressure. Like something's wrong here, right? So now they think there's too much water in the system to turn off the emergency pumps. I got to tell you, in the hindsight, they said if the guys had done nothing and had just sat on their hands the whole time, there would have been fewer problems. Like literally, they're making a series of mistakes here. Okay, now. There is still a lot of heat going in, so the water starts pressurizing that relief tank to the point where it's fully full, and it starts spilling into the containment vessel, which sets off a whole new set of alarms. So now, but they're still getting signals. They're thinking there's too much water in the system, even though the reactor core is already uncovered. So our fast neutrons are doing the things, bad stuff's going on. The pumps now lose enough water, because they don't have actually enough water, that they start to cavitate, they start to get air into the system, which will damage those pumps, so they shut off too. By the way, this all happened at 4 o'clock in the morning. Of course it would, right? On the third shift. So at 6 a.m., the new shift comes in. And part of the problem with 3 Mile Island is, you know how you build your options panel with every knob and switch on it? Well, that's what it looked like inside of 3 Mile Island. It's actually really hard to read, and they couldn't see everything from where they were. And the rules said they weren't allowed to see. If you're in a crisis and you're operating, you don't leave your seat. So there were controls they could not see. But the shift change come in at 6 o'clock, and they're able to walk around before they actually do the shift change and see that the behavior indicates the PRV is not actually closed. So the first ones to catch on with the real issue, which is that you are still losing coolant, and we should get that valve actually closed. So they do close it with a blocking valve. There's another way to close it off. They cut that part off. The problem is at this point it's already too late, and the reactor core is exposed, and it's beginning to melt. This is a drawing of what actually happened to the reactor core. So the top of the core gets exposed first for obvious reasons. The energy reaction goes much higher. It starts to melt different pieces of the core. That starts to flow down the sides and collect in the bottom, but it did not breach the primary containment vessel. They continue now to manually pump water into it, but it's so hot in there, they're afraid of pumping water too quickly that it'll actually create a steam explosion. So they're trickling water in, and they're measuring the pressure increase, and they're letting that pressure come off. And if you remember anything about this, I don't know that anybody here is old enough, or much less from North America, to have seen all this. They burped some of the steam out of the primary containment vessel to try and control it, and so it had small amounts of radioactivity that were pretty safe, but this is what created the panic, is when there was a release. But it was, we need to get more water in here before this thing catches fire. We don't want to create steam explosions. When the pressure gets too high, we bleed off some of the steam, then we pump more water, pump more water, pump more water. They got through it. It took about 3 days. Their communication processes sucked. Their procedures sucked. Like, they'd done everything wrong, but they more or less got through it. Now, I will say in the upside, again, primary vessel never got breached. This reactor was ruined. All the water in the containment vessel and so forth had enough radioactivity, and they've never used reactor 2 again. They actually took this entire assembly apart about a decade later and went and stored it away, vitrified it, and got rid of it. And actually turned reactor 1 back on again and continued to operate it. It only shut down in 2019 because it was too expensive to operate. Although recently, Microsoft has just offered to lease that reactor to run AI workloads from it. Because they don't care how much electricity costs. They think there's another 20 years left in that reactor. But this certainly soured the Americans and created fun movies like the China Syndrome. You know, the Americans love to pile on this kind of thing. And so really soured nuclear power for the United States, and that affects most of the rest of the world. If you want to talk about a real disaster, let's talk about Chernobyl. Now, there's been whole movies made about Chernobyl. You're welcome to go and watch these. I think they're remarkably accurate. This was a test that went terribly wrong to the point where an entire 50-ton reactor core was blown out of the building. Would not recommend. Okay? A lot of people died trying to fight that fire. That the town of Pripyat was fully evacuated and still is to this day. Chernobyl just killed again during the early stages of the Ukraine-Russian war. The Russians took control of this area, and some overachiever officer decided to tell a bunch of soldiers to dig some slit trenches beside the road, with the locals going, "That's going to kill you," and it did. There's enough radioactivity 40 years later in the ground around Chernobyl to this day that if you dig down in it, you'll get a lethal dose of radiation in minutes. That's what happens when you blow 50 tons of radioactive material around. Now, compare this to Hiroshima and Nagasaki with their bombs detonated on them in 1945, who are thriving, fine cities today. It's just nowhere near the amount of materials talking. 63 kilos in Hiroshima, 6 kilos in Nagasaki. After a few years, all of that was gone. Nobody knows when this is. This site is catastrophic. By the way, they are running the other 3 reactors still to this day. They built an initial sarcophagus over top of reactor 4. This is the modern one that was finished only in 2017. The rest of the reactors are still operational. It is the worst case scenario, what happened at Chernobyl. Admittedly, the RBMK design is a notoriously bad reactor design that everybody else has stopped running except for the Russians and the Ukrainians. But when operated correctly, you'll be all right. This is a combination of events. This is the way the Soviet Union operated and, helped propagate their collapse, as well as just a clear example of what not to do. Okay, Fukushima. 2011, a remarkably severe tsunami occurred, one of the very first ones to be broadcast on live television because it happened to happen in the morning when the traffic helicopters were up. So if you watched all of that, you saw people dying in their cars trying to run away from a wave. The Fukushima site actually has 6 reactors on it. We only ever talk about 1 through 4, these ones here. These is 5 and 6 over here. They are slightly more modern design, and so they had none of the problems that the other reactors have. So these, as is normal procedure in Japan, when there's an earthquake, all nuclear reactors scram immediately. There's possibility that the shaking is going to damage the containment vessels, any number of things, so the faster you can cool those reactors down, the better. Reactors 1 through 3 were operational, 4 was shut down for refueling. 5 and 6 were running as well, but they were all scrammed. The difference is 5 and 6 have passive cool downs. They're an enhanced version 2, and so when you shut them off, though enough water naturally flows through their reactor systems that they just cool themselves down, you don't have to do anything else. But 1 through 4 require pumping. You have to keep running the water over them to cool them down for weeks to actually get them to go cold. And so those things powered up automatically because there was none of those reactors running. They use diesel generators. And even though they had been ordered not to, they had put the diesel generators in the basement. Nobody expected the wall that they had built in front of the reactor to be overtopped by anything, and they were incorrect. It would overtop the wall by 3 meters. The wave water made it to here. So the entire reactor site and all of its processing facilities had water go completely through it. It flooded all of the generators, destroyed them all, and the water stopped pumping. Right? That is what propagated the crisis. In this case now, the Japanese, now why did these reactors passively cool down and these reactors need pumping? Because these reactors are about 4 years newer. There were upgrade kits for these reactors to have passive cool down, but it would take 2 years to install them, and there was only 10 years left on the reactor, and they didn't want to spend the money. It's not an unreasonable thing. Hey, look, we've got a big seawall, we've got all these safety systems, they just happen to be wrong. So, a very brave set of people stayed there through this tsunami and everything being wrapped around them to try and operate these reactors to cold. They eventually started pumping seawater into them and then trying to contain that. There were 2 people killed on the site from the tsunami, which arguably are the only people killed in this disaster, except for deaths due to evacuation. As the explosions occurred, and these are not nuclear explosions, these are hydrogen explosions. As the reactor cores overheated, again, went fast neutron, they began, as those cores start to overheat, they emit hydrogen. It's part of the way that zirconium breaks down, and as hydrogen concentrations built up, they couldn't vent them properly because they didn't have any power. And that caused these hydrogen explosions. So not a steam explosion, not a radioactive explosion, but the explosions nonetheless there was enough radioactive material hanging around there that it was a certain amount of cesium and iodine emitted. Radioactive iodine is particularly nasty because your body uses it. So if you inhale or ingest any iodine that's radioactive, it'll stay inside of your body and grow cancer on you. Which is one of the reasons why back in the old Cold War days, you got iodine tablets. The idea being if there's going to be a nuclear explosion, you take a bunch of iodine so that your body has no ability to consume any more iodine, so you won't take on the radioactive iodine. So the concern of that emission, they evacuate several neighborhoods near the site, mostly filled with elderly, and several of them die of the stress of being evacuated. At no point are there significant amounts of radiation actually measured in the area. So more people died from the evacuation than died from the incident. The Japanese continue to pump water to this day through those reactor cores. These were containment breaches. So that steel pressure vessel, they melted through the bottom of them. On at least two of them, possibly 3. They still don't know because they keep building robots to go in and looking, and the radiation destroys the robots before they get there. But they're getting a little bit further, and they've also built robots to drag the old dead ones back. But this is all water that has been pumped through those reactors to cool them down. And now they've built a processing facility to clean this water of all of the high radioactives in it. In fact, they've gotten everything radioactive out of the water except the tritium. So tritium is an isotope of hydrogen. It has 2 neutrons in it, and it is mildly radioactive. It's a naturally occurring element. It can't really hurt you, but it's the hydrogen. It's in the water. And so they're now have asked and received permission to pump that tritiized water back into the ocean. Because if these containers start to breach, you're going to have bigger problems, and they've kind of run out of land, like they've really done everything they could. There's a lot of uproar about this that is not particularly scientifically based. Tritium is just not that unusual, and the ocean contains it anyway. They're starting to empty some of these tanks out to have more place to continue to process, because it's still years away from finishing. TEPCO has promised they'll completely clean this site up. It's going to be a lot of work. Again, it's radioactive enough because they've gone through the pressurized containment vessel. They're trying to build robots to go in there, and if they ever finally build a robot tough enough to do this, we'll have a new technology on our hands, because it is very tough to resist that level of radiation. They have fried a lot of robots trying. But it's serious. And now that I've told you the 3 worst stories, and believe me, there's more, let's be very clear. When you do the math, fewer people have died from making nuclear power than anything else. If you want a killer, look at coal. Just the miners alone. Don't even talk about the cancer cases that come out of the emissions of coal. Or the other catastrophic events like an ash fall. When you run coal power plants, you make ash, lots of it. It's quite toxic, so you store it in ponds. And if you're not very careful and spend money to keep those ponds in good shape, sometimes you'll have a pond slump like this and poison everything behind it. This killed 20 people, not even talking about the long-term effects of the damage that occurred from these. Or the power plant explosion in 2010 for a combined cycle natural gas plant, where a test went wrong and killed 5 people and injured 27 others. Making electricity is dangerous. And just earlier this year in Italy, a hydroelectric plant had a runaway turbine that caught fire and exploded and killed 7. These are large-scale industrial systems, and they are dangerous. Our civilization runs on electricity, and we run the risk. So when we talk about killers, the death rate on nuclear energy is very, very low. It's not a justification not to use it. Which begs the question, why? Why don't we use it? And the real answer is because it's ridiculously expensive. Part of it has to do with the fear and the safety systems that we've built around them to try and make them safe, right? That we press our politicians to make them safer, and then so what they do is they regulate it to the point where it's very hard to operate. So there's an argument that we could come up with better reactor designs. Let's make a better type of reactor. And so there's a bunch of different ideas here. The sodium reactor is one approach to it. This is a fast reactor. We've got about 20 of these built around the world over the past 50 years. They are very difficult to operate. Like, when you think about safety, don't think about sodium, right? We always experiment with these, but it's just that fast reactors are challenging. They run at very high temperatures, and they use molten sodium as which is not a moderator, so that's why they have still a fast reaction, but it's the working fluid. But it also means you can't see into the reactor. You don't really know what's going on inside of it. And sodium catches fire in air and explodes with contact with water, so woo. So there's a cool idea. I know I'm already running out of time. I'm having too much fun with this. Let's assemble reactor cores with the moderator built in. This is called a triso fuel. So it's about the size of a tennis ball, and we put the uranium in the center of it, and then we put these really hard layers over top of it, including a bunch of graphite as the moderator, so it only emits slow neutrons, right? And you can roll these things around, and you put them through a reactor called a pebble bed reactor. But because it's completely dry, you have no water involved, and it's all sealed, this will run at 800, 900 degrees centigrade. So you just pump the working fluid. In this case, it'd probably be carbon dioxide or even helium, which collects all that heat, and then you heat exchange it against a water reaction, spin turbines as per usual, right? But the nice thing here is you don't care how hot it gets. The downside is the fuel's expensive to make. When it gets this hot, weird things happen. We've had problems with cracking and so forth. The balls sometimes jam together. Nobody wants to go in there. Like, that's bad. And the fuel's harder to reprocess. So this is an immature technology, and it'll take 20 years to kind of figure this out. Same thing when we get to molten salt reactors. I want to love molten salt reactors. I did a whole hour on molten salt reactors. There's a lot that's cool inside of this reactor. Instead of using solid fuel, we stay in uranium, we make a uranium tetrafluoride, which is kind of alien blood. Like fluorine's dangerous stuff. It'll burn through almost anything, but we've got good containment for it, but it naturally separates out those radioactive gases so you don't have the poisoning problem. You can burn more of the fuel. You kind of use everything up. It's got a continuous reprocess. It doesn't need pressurization because it's so hot. It turns to a solid at 400 degrees centigrade. So it'll shut itself off. Like it's really quite a safe reactor design. Operating temperature is about 1200 degrees. Huge working range to work in. But it's immature. Like the time it'll take to mature this up, there's other ways to solve this problem. So, and that's the bit on the thorium fuel cycle. If anybody's, instead of using uranium, use thorium. Just understand that in order to use thorium, you have to bombard it with neutrons. Then it becomes praseodymium, and then it becomes uranium. So I know we're all talking about, hey, thorium's better because it's 5 times more plentiful. Well, yes, it is. But what you do when you use thorium is you breed it into uranium. So is it actually less nuclear proliferant? Not really, no. It kind of works the same way. Other places have thorium. It's a byproduct of mining rare earth minerals, so it's easy to come by. But in the end, you're still going to do the same thing, more or less. Oh, and the reprocessing for it is just as fun a diagram as last time. All right. We could make safer reactors. We aren't because the technology that was mature by the military to make bombs, and nobody's willing to pay for it. Full stop. It's about a $100 billion proposition to really do this. The Chinese are doing a bit of it, like they've got a pebble bed reactor and they've got a molten salt reactor, like they're experimenting with some of this. Most everyone else is not. The real issue is this. This is the price of power for wind and solar, the cheapest power in the world today. That's because it doesn't run at night, right? Offshore wind's a bit more expensive. There's our cheapest continuous power, gas. There's nuclear. That's the real issue. Nuclear power costs too much. They turned off the 3 Mile Island reactor because it costs too much. You have to get the cost down. So here's the idea, and this is what I'll send you away with. It's called the small modular reactor. So stop building bespoke reactors where everyone is unique and each one needs to be individual certified. And stop processing the fuel on site. There's 2 different tasks here. There's the task of building the reactor, and there's the task of operating the reactor. So the idea is make the reactor small enough that it can be assembled in a factory, fueled. And then you transport it by truck to a site. Right? Now this is not that weird. We already transport fuel by truck. So just bring the whole reactor with you and take it to a site where it's slid into a bay. Now this reactor design is a 3 design, so it's totally passively cooled. Right? You don't need to pump water, you don't have to do a thing. It'll run on its own, it's pretty much unsupervised, and it'll run for 2 years on the fuel that's in it. So you can imagine a site where you have a bunch of these, right? 3 or 4 of them are running, generating your electricity, and they're about 300 megawatts each, so that's a decent reactor side. And you've got one that's getting ready to start running, you got one that's about to go out, right? I would actually think you'd build this bigger so that every month you're replacing one of the reactors every 2 years. And you have a separate site that does the fuel handling. Now that's a factory site. It's where they manufacture the reactors. They also take the spent reactors back, take them apart, take the old fuel out for reprocessing, build new reactors and bring them back. Now what's the strength of this? Well, the first is you do the dangerous stuff away from people. You kind of want to make your electricity close to people because they're the ones that are going to use it. Right now, if you're going to build a normal, contemporary, bespoke reactor site, you need about a 5-kilometer exclusion zone around it. Those are hard to come by. But if you're not going to handle the fuel, you can do a half-kilometer exclusion zone. It's a lot safer. And then you have a separate site that's building reactors for all of the sites where you generate electricity. So this is what's now beginning to happen in Canada with the Darlington B site, is they've committed to the Hitachi GE SMR 300. Ontario runs on nuclear power, much like France does. And so now they're going to build these small reactors and the processing sites up in the shield away from everyone. But here's the bigger thing for us as software people. You get a new reactor every 2 years, right? You ship the old one out, you bring the new one in, which means continuous improvement. Instead of waiting 50 years to put a new reactor down on the same site, every 2 years you replace a reactor. So your parts don't get as old. You get to recondition on a regular basis, and you get to get into an innovation cadence. The manufacturing methodology is naturally going to lower the price. The individual reactors are not that important, right? You don't have 1, 2, or maybe 4, and each one of them is a precious resource. You have bunches of them, and you just keep switching them out. And they're smaller scale, so you can put them like, we've got the far north in Canada where nothing else works, right? They mostly run on diesel electric power. I want to talk about expensive, inefficient power. That's the worst. But if every 2 years a new reactor came in, dropped in the ground, and the old one was taken away, and that's your electricity, it's clean, it's efficient, and we can actually get them better. Right now, our mature reactor technology is the light water reactor. The Canadians developed a heavy water reactor, so it's deuterized water. Why? Because we didn't want to enrich uranium, right? We don't have nuclear weapons. We don't want them. And so we didn't need the plutonium, and so we used heavy water instead. We just stopped developing it because reactors fell out of favor. So you build the light water version that's currently already certified and ready to go. And in a few years, you make a heavy water version of that. Now you're not enriching as much uranium. And maybe you can make a molten salt reactor in that form factor. You have a choice. Right? There's a series of steps that can be done here to continue to improve it. And folks are doing it. This is the Darlington B site, and this is now committed to these light water modular reactors. I wonder if the best thing that's going to come out of the wave of AI insanity that's going on right now is that all of these big tech companies need more electricity. Maybe they'll spend the money to actually mature this technology. Because there's no military applications here, just stuff we need. But the upside of nuclear is it's safe. It makes electricity with very little supervision. It emits no carbon in the process, or relatively little. You still have to move a truck around. And it runs 24 hours a day reliably. I hope this was useful for you. It's exciting for me to talk about it. I'm glad you enjoyed it. If you want to listen to the Geek Outs, if you go to geekout.show, that'll take you to the .NET Rock site. You can search on space or energy or any of those topics. There's 100 hours or so of that stuff. Thank you so much for your time.